The sonic emitter screamed into frequencies that human ears could not detect, that the HFY could hear it. The charging pack collapsed into chaos as the subsonic noise flooded their communication. Channels with meaningless static hunters that had moved as one suddenly stumbled over each other. Their coordination shattered. They crashed into the canyon walls and tripped over the bones of their previous victims. For the first time in their evolutionary history, they could not hear each other. They could not hear the Alpha. They were alone. Una did not hesitate. She raised her weapon and fired at the nearest hunter, placing her shot in the gap between its chest plates where the armor was weakest. The creature shrieked and fell. She moved immediately, dodging the blind swipe of another hunter that had lost track of her position in the confusion. Her second shot took it through the eye, and it dropped like a puppet with cut strings. The remaining hunters scattered in panic, each one reacting to threats that were not there. Without their pack coordination, they were just individual predators. Dangerous but predictable, Una tracked them through the chaos and placed her shots with careful precision. A third hunter fell. When it presented its unarmored throat while turning to flee, a fourth died when it charged her position, and she sidestepped its lunge, driving a bullet into the soft tissue behind its skull. 4 rounds spent, 1 round left. The fifth hunter broke and ran, scrambling up the canyon wall with desperate speed. It had learned something its species had never known before. It had learned fear. Una let it go. She needed to save her last round for the Alpha. The massive creature had not panicked like the others. It stood at the far end of the canyon with its orange eyes fixed on her, its body trembling as it fought against the sonic interference through sheer will. The Alpha was different from its pack. It was smarter and stronger, and it refused to let noise in its head break its focus. It charged. Una fired her last round, and the bullet struck true, punching through the armor at the Alpha's shoulder. The creature staggered but did not stop. Blood poured from the wound, but its legs kept driving forward. 3 meters. 2 meters. Una dropped the empty weapon and drew her knife. 1 meter. The Alpha lunged with jaws that could crush bone like paper. Una threw herself to the side and rolled beneath the creature's bulk, coming up behind it before it could turn. She had memorized every detail of HFY anatomy during her long hours studying the datapad. She knew exactly where the gap in the armor existed at the base of the skull. She knew exactly how to angle a blade to reach the brain. The Alpha twisted to face her, and she moved with it, staying in its blind spot. Her knife found the gap between the armor plates, and she drove it home with both hands. The creature made a sound that was almost human, a sigh of surprise and pain and something that might have been respect. Then it collapsed at her feet and did not move again. Una stood over the body of the Alpha and breathed. Her hands were shaking, and her vision was blurred with exhaustion. Blood covered her arms up to the elbows, some of it hers and most of it not. Around her, the canyon was silent except for the fading hum of the sonic emitter as its borrowed power cell died. She had killed 6 apex predators with 10 rounds and a knife. She had done what a fully equipped battalion could not do. She had survived. The next 3 days passed in a haze of exhaustion and pain. Una returned to the shuttle and treated her wounds as best she could with the limited medical supplies that had survived the crash. She ate her remaining nutrient packs and collected water from the stream, now that nothing hunted in this part of the jungle. The surviving HFY did not return. She saw them once at the edge of her vision, dark shapes watching from the tree line, but when she turned to face them, they retreated into the shadows. They had learned what she was. They wanted no part of her. On the 4th day, the rescue shuttle arrived. It descended through the amber sky and landed in the clearing near the crash site, its engines kicking up clouds of dust and debris. A squad of Survey Corps soldiers emerged in full combat armor, their weapons raised and their sensors scanning for threats. They found Sergeant Una Park sitting on the wreckage of her shuttle, cleaning blood from her combat knife with a torn piece of fabric. She looked up at them with eyes that had seen too much and endured too much. "What took so long?" she asked. The squad leader was a Vorathi, a tall insectoid species that considered humans beneath notice. He stared at the human woman, surrounded by alien jungle, and struggled to process what he was seeing. "You survived," he said. "That is not possible. The HFY killed an entire battalion here." Una stood and sheathed her knife. "They tried to kill me too," she said. "It did not work out for them." She led the rescue team to the canyon and showed them the bodies. 6 HFY, including the Alpha, killed by a single human with minimal equipment in one of the most dangerous environments in the galaxy. The soldiers took images and samples and readings while Una sat on a boulder and waited for them to finish. She did not feel pride or triumph. She felt tired and hollow and ready to leave this world behind forever. The rescue shuttle lifted off as the sun began to set. Una watched through the viewport as the jungle moon of Veth-4 shrank below her. Somewhere down there, the surviving HFY were learning to fear a new kind of prey. She hoped they would remember the lesson 6 months later. A Survey Corps expedition returned to Veth-4 to study the ecosystem. The xenobiologists reported something strange in their findings. The HFY had developed a new behavior that defied explanation. When they detected human scent in their territory, they did not hunt. They retreated. They hid in their dens until the scent faded. They had encountered something on that moon that rewrote their understanding of the universe. They had encountered a human, and they would never forget what she had taught them. The Galactic Council reclassified humans from expendable scouts to specialist survivalists after the incident. Survey Corps' command quietly deleted the mission parameters that had sent Una to Veth-4, expecting her to die. But Sergeant Una Park did not care about classifications or politics or the opinions of species that had considered her worthless. She only cared about one thing. She had been left alone with 10 rounds and a knife, and she had won. The third day changed everything. Una woke to find the jungle around the crash site empty of the usual background sounds. No insects clicked in the undergrowth. No small creatures rustled through the fallen leaves. The silence pressed against her ears like a physical weight. The HFY had changed their strategy. She discovered this when she attempted to forage for water at a stream she had found the previous day. Pack was waiting for her, spread across the jungle in a wide formation that cut off every path back to the shuttle. They were not circling anymore. They were herding. She recognized the tactic from her grandmother's stories about wolf hunts. In the old days, the predators would push their prey toward a kill zone, a place where escape was impossible, and the pack could attack from all directions at once. Una retreated slowly, testing the gaps in their formation. Every time she moved toward an opening, one of the creatures would appear to block her path. They were driving her east, away from the shuttle and toward something they wanted her to find. She climbed. The massive trees of Veth-4 had bark covered with handholds. Where branches had fallen away over the years, Una scaled the nearest trunk with desperate speed, her muscles screaming in protest as she hauled herself higher and higher. The HFY could climb, but their heavy bodies made them slow and clumsy in the canopy. By the time they reached the branches where she had been, she had already moved to another tree. From above, she could see the terrain they had been pushing her toward. A canyon cut through the jungle half a kilometer to the east, its walls steep and smooth. The bottom was littered with wreckage and bones. She recognized the remains of military vehicles and the skeletal forms of soldiers in Survey Corps armor. This was where the HFY had killed the battalion 6 years ago. This was their kill zone, the place where they had learned that even armed prey could be destroyed if you controlled the battlefield. They had tried to drive her here because the canyon walls would prevent escape, and the narrow floor would let them attack in waves. Without risking too many hunters at once, it was a perfect trap. Una stayed in the canopy and watched the pack regroup below. They were frustrated by her refusal to follow their plan, their movements jerky and aggressive as they tried to figure out how to reach her. She used the time to observe their communication. The HFY did not make sounds she could hear, but she noticed something strange about their behavior. When the Alpha wanted the pack to move, its chest would vibrate briefly before the others responded. When the hunters coordinated an approach, their chests would pulse in sequence like a silent conversation. They were using subsonic communication. Sounds too low for human ears to detect, but perfectly audible to their own species. That was how they coordinated their hunts so precisely. That was how they had overwhelmed the battalion despite being outnumbered. She needed to disrupt that communication if she wanted to survive. The pack spent hours trying to reach her in the trees. 3 times she had to use her weapon to drive back hunters that got too close. 3 rounds gone. She had 5 left and the sun was beginning to set. She could not stay in the canopy forever. Eventually, exhaustion would cause her to fall, or the creatures would learn to climb more effectively. She needed to end this on her terms. Una dropped from the canopy. When a gap appeared in the pack formation, she hit the ground running and sprinted toward the canyon instead of away from it. The HFY howled behind her and gave chase. She was faster than them in short bursts, but they had more endurance, and they knew the terrain. By the time she reached the canyon edge, they were close enough that she could hear their breath. She half climbed and half fell down the canyon wall, sliding through loose soil and catching herself on roots before she hit the bottom. The HFY followed more carefully, their heavy bodies finding purchase on the steep slope with practiced ease. They had her now. The canyon walls rose around her like the walls of a grave, and the bones of dead soldiers crunched beneath her feet. She had maybe 2 minutes before the pack reached the canyon floor and tore her apart. Una ran through the wreckage, searching for anything useful. Most of the equipment had been destroyed or corroded by 6 years of exposure to the jungle environment. But Survey Corps battalions carried specialized gear for planetary exploration, including devices for detecting underground resources. She found the sonic emitter half buried beneath a collapsed vehicle. It was a simple device designed to send sound waves into the ground and measure the echoes to find mineral deposits. The power cell was dead, but the wave generator was intact. She pried it open with her knife and connected it to the power cell from her damaged datapad. The device hummed to life just as the first HFY reached the canyon floor. Una adjusted the frequency output to match what she had observed from the creatures' chest vibrations. She could not replicate their language, but she could generate noise on the same frequency. She could make them deaf to each other. The Alpha emerged from the shadows. At the far end of the canyon, it had stayed back, while the others descended, watching from above to direct the final assault. Now it came down to witness her death in person. Una stood in the center of the kill zone with the sonic emitter in one hand and her weapon in the other. She had 5 rounds left. She had a knife. She had a device that might work, or might do nothing at all. The pack spread out around her in a closing circle. 6 hunters plus the Alpha 7 against 1 in a place designed for slaughter. Una smiled. She had been told her entire life that humans were primitive, expendable, not worth the resources to protect. She had been sent to this death world because nobody expected her to survive. But here she stood, covered in mud and blood and the dust of dead soldiers, and she was not afraid. The Alpha gave some signal she could not perceive, and the pack charged. Una pressed the activation button on the sonic emitter, and everything changed. Una moved through the jungle at midday when the HFY were least active. The creatures preferred darkness for their hunts and retreated to dens during the brightest hours. Their thermal vision less effective when the ambient temperature rose closer to body heat. She had a narrow window to work with, and she intended to use every second of it. The jungle floor was soft beneath her boots and covered with layers of decaying vegetation that muffled her footsteps. Massive trees rose around her like the pillars of an ancient temple, their bark covered with bioluminescent moss that would glow blue when darkness returned. Strange insects buzzed past her head, and small creatures scattered through the undergrowth at her approach. She was not trying to hide her presence. She wanted the HFY to know she had left the shuttle. She wanted them confused and uncertain about what she was doing. Yuna followed the trails that the creatures had worn into the jungle floor, paths beaten smooth by countless hunts over countless years. Her grandmother had taught her to read animal trails, to understand the patterns of movement the predators used when stalking their territory. The HFY were creatures of habit despite their intelligence. They used the same routes to approach the crash site each night, because those routes offered the best combination of cover and speed. That predictability was their weakness. She spent hours exploring the terrain around the shuttle, mapping the choke points where the trails narrowed between massive tree roots or rock formations. These were the places where ambush was possible, where a single defender could face attackers one at a time instead of being surrounded. She found 3 locations that suited her purposes. At each one she gathered materials for traps. The first trap was a pit covered with thin branches and leaves, dug deep enough to injure but not kill. She lined the bottom with sharpened stakes carved from fallen wood using her combat knife. The second trap was a deadfall, a heavy log suspended by vines that would drop when a trigger line was disturbed. The third was simpler, just a snare that would tangle legs and slow movement for precious seconds. Her grandmother would have been proud of the work. The traps were crude by military standards, but they were effective. More importantly, they were unexpected. The HFY had hunted on this moon for generations without ever encountering prey that fought back with anything more than panic and desperation. They had never faced an enemy that prepared the battlefield against them. As the light began to fade, Yuna gathered torn strips of fabric from her uniform and rubbed them against her skin to transfer her scent. She placed these along false trails that led away from the crash site, creating paths that smelled like fleeing prey. If the HFY followed their instincts, some of them would pursue these decoys instead of approaching as a coordinated pack. Divide and conquer. She returned to a position near the first trap as darkness fell and waited. The jungle came alive around her with sounds. She was beginning to recognize the clicks of insects and the calls of nocturnal creatures formed a background rhythm that changed when predators moved through an area. She had learned to listen for the silence that preceded danger. It came an hour after full dark. The normal sounds of the jungle faded as the HFY began their nightly hunt. Yuna pressed herself against the trunk of a massive tree and held her breath. The mud on her skin had dried and cracked, but it still masked enough of her heat signature to make her difficult to detect. She heard movement along the trail. Below her position, one of the younger HFY was following her scent, its armored body low to the ground as it tracked her path toward the pit trap. It moved with the confidence of a creature that had never known fear, never encountered anything on this world that could challenge its supremacy. That confidence ended when the ground collapsed beneath it. The creature screamed as it fell into the pit, and the sharpened stakes pierced the gaps in its armor. The sound was terrible, a shriek of pain and rage that echoed through the jungle and brought answering calls from the rest of the pack. The injured HFY thrashed in the pit, trying to climb out but unable to find purchase. On the smooth walls Yuna had carved, she did not approach to finish it. The trap had served its purpose simply by existing. The pack would have to deal with an injured member. Now, they would have to decide whether to leave it behind or slow down to help. She watched from her hidden position as two more Kethvari arrived at the pit. They circled the edge, their orange eyes blazing with an emotion she could only interpret as confusion. One of them reached down with a forelimb to help the trapped creature climb out. They were not abandoning their wounded. That told her something important about their social structure. They protected each other. They valued the pack over individual advantage. That meant killing. One of them would hurt the others in ways beyond simple numbers. She retreated silently through the darkness while the pack was distracted. The injured creature eventually escaped the pit with help from the others, but it was limping badly and would not be able to hunt effectively. 6 hunters now instead of 7, but the victory meant less than the message it sent. Yuna returned to the crash site as the night deepened. She did not hide inside the shuttle this time. Instead, she gathered dry vegetation and pieces of wreckage and built a fire in the open ground in front of the breach. The flames rose into the darkness and cast dancing shadows across the jungle edge. She sat beside the fire with her knife across her knees and waited. The Kethvari came. She saw their shapes at the edge of the light, their armored bodies catching the glow of the flames. They had followed her trail back to the shuttle, expecting to find prey hiding in terror. Instead, they found her sitting in the open, making no attempt to conceal herself. She was not behaving like prey. She was not running or hiding or showing fear. She was acting like something they had never encountered before. The Alpha emerged from the shadows at the far edge of the firelight. It was larger than the others, its scales darker and its eyes burning with an intelligence that felt almost human. For a long moment it simply looked at her across the flames. Yuna met its gaze without flinching. She saw curiosity in those alien eyes, and beneath it something that might have been the beginning of doubt. The Alpha turned and retreated into the darkness. The others followed. Yuna exhaled and allowed herself a small smile. She had not won. She had not even come close to winning, but she had done something far more important. She had made them hesitate. She had planted a seed of uncertainty in the mind of the creature that controlled the pack. Tomorrow night they would come again, more cautious and more careful, and she would be ready with more traps and more surprises. The hunt had changed now. It was no longer predator and prey. It was something closer to a war, and Yuna Park had been fighting wars her entire life. The first thing Sergeant Yuna Park felt was pain, and the second thing she felt was cold metal pressing against her cheek. She opened her eyes slowly and found herself staring at the shattered control panel of the survey shuttle. Its screens dark and cracked like broken ice on a frozen lake. Blood dripped from a wound on her forehead, and she wiped it away with the back of her hand before pushing herself upright. The crash had torn the shuttle nearly in half. Sparks flickered from exposed wiring, and the emergency lights cast everything in a dim red glow that made the interior look like the inside of a dying heart. Yuna looked to her left and saw Lieutenant Morvax still strapped into his seat, his gray skin pale and his 4 eyes staring at nothing. To her right, Specialist then had been thrown through the viewport and lay motionless among the jungle vegetation that had invaded through the breach. She did not need to check their pulses to know they were gone. The Survey Corps had sent them to Vethfor to collect biological samples from a quarantine world that the Galactic Council had declared off limits 6 years ago. Now Yuna understood why she unstrapped herself and fell hard to the tilted floor, her body protesting with a symphony of aches and sharp stabs of pain. Nothing felt broken, but everything felt wrong. She crawled to the emergency supply locker and found it partially crushed, its contents scattered across the cabin like offerings. At a funeral, Yuna gathered what she could find: a ball, standard issue sidearm with 10 rounds in the magazine and no spare ammunition, her combat knife, still secured in its sheath on her thigh, a damaged datapad that flickered to life when she pressed the activation button, its screen cracked but functional, 3 nutrient packs that would keep her alive for maybe 3 days if she rationed them carefully. The emergency beacon was destroyed, smashed beyond recognition when a support beam had collapsed during impact. She had no way to call for help and no way to know if anyone would come looking. Survey course. Protocol classified missions to quarantine worlds as acceptable losses if contact was lost. She was alone on a death world with minimal supplies and no extraction plan. Yuna made her way to the breach in the hull and looked out at the jungle moon of Veth 4. Massive trees rose hundreds of meters into a sky that glowed amber with the light of the gas giant. This moon orbited bioluminescent plants pulsed with soft blue light beneath the canopy, and strange sounds echoed through the undergrowth like whispers in an alien language. The air was thick and humid and carried scents she could not identify, some sweet and some sharp like copper. She activated the datapad and scrolled through the partial fauna files that had survived the crash. Most of the data was corrupted, but one entry remained intact, and when she read it, her blood turned cold. Ketvari apex predators native to Veth 4, pack hunters with armored hides that could deflect standard ammunition, unless fired at close range into the gaps between their plates, thermal vision that allowed them to track prey in complete darkness. Intelligence classified as near sentient, capable of coordinating complex ambush and learning from failed hunts. 6 years ago, a fully equipped Survey Corps battalion had landed on Veth 4 to establish a research outpost. 200 soldiers with heavy weapons and combat vehicles. Ketvari had killed them all in 3 days. That was why the Galactic Council had declared this world a quarantine zone. That was why Survey Corps Command had classified this mission as expendable. That was why they had sent a human and 2 aliens with minimal equipment instead of a proper military force. Yuna heard movement in the tree line. She raised her sidearm and aimed toward the sound, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. Something was watching her from the shadows between the massive trunks. She saw a flash of dark scales and the glint of eyes that reflected the bioluminescent glow like mirrors in the darkness. Then another movement to her left and another to her right. She counted 7 distinct shapes circling the crash site at the edge of visibility, their movements fluid and predatory. The Ketvari had found her. Yuna did not run. Running was what prey did, and prey always died on worlds like this. Instead, she stepped back into the shuttle and positioned herself near the breach where she had a clear line of sight to the approaches. She steadied her breathing and watched. The creatures did not attack. They circled closer with each pass, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested they were communicating through means she could not perceive. They tested the perimeter, darting forward and then retreating when she tracked them with her weapon. They were probing her defenses, measuring her responses, cataloging her behavior. Yuna had hunted with her grandmother in the highlands of Old Korea as a child. She had learned to read the body language of predators, to understand when they were committed to a strike and when they were simply gathering information. These creatures were not ready to kill her yet. They wanted to understand her first. Hours passed and the amber light faded as the gas giant rotated and cast the moon into shadow. Darkness fell over the jungle like a heavy blanket, and the bioluminescent plants grew brighter, creating pools of blue light separated by stretches of absolute blackness. Yuna could no longer see the Ketvari, but she could hear them moving closer. She could feel their presence like a weight pressing against her skin. One of them emerged from the shadows close enough for her to see clearly for the first time. It was massive. easily 3 meters long and covered in overlapping scales that looked like plates of dark armor. 6 limbs supported its muscular body, and its head was flat and wide, with a mouth full of teeth designed for tearing flesh. Its eyes burned with an orange glow as it observed her with an intensity that felt almost intelligent. It was studying her the way she had studied predators. Back home, it was trying to predict what she would do. Yuna met its gaze and did not look away. She held her sidearm steady and her knife ready, and she showed it no fear because she had none left to show. Fear was a luxury for people who had options. She had only 10 rounds in the blade, and the stubborn refusal to die quietly. The creature tilted its head as if confused by her stillness. Then it turned and melted back into the darkness. Yuna exhaled slowly and leaned against the shuttle wall. They would come again. They would keep testing her until they understood her patterns, and then they would strike. With overwhelming force, she had maybe 2 days before they figured her out. But as she watched the shadows beyond the firelight of the sparking shuttle, she realized something that changed everything. They were not the only ones learning. She was learning too. She was learning their formation patterns and their communication signals. She was learning which ones were bold and which ones were cautious. She was learning which one gave the orders, and she was already planning how to kill it first. The first night taught Yuna that the Kethvari were patient in a way that most predators were not. They did not rush their hunts. They did not gamble on single opportunities. They gathered information until they had certainty, and then they struck. With precision that left nothing to chance. That was how they had killed 200 soldiers 6 years ago. The shuttle offered minimal protection, now that the hull was breached in 3 places. Yuna positioned herself in the center of the cabin, where she could see all 3 openings at once. But she knew this was not a sustainable defense. The creatures tested each breach point in rotation throughout the night, their dark shapes appearing briefly in the dim light before withdrawing. They never committed to an actual attack. They simply watched her reaction and then tried another angle. By midnight, she understood what they were doing. They were mapping her response patterns. They wanted to know how fast she could turn, how quickly she could aim, which direction she would prioritize when multiple threats appeared simultaneously. They were building a complete picture of her capabilities so they could design the perfect ambush. Yuna fired 1 round when the boldest of them pushed too far into the breach on her left. The bullet sparked against its armored hide, but the impact drove it back with a screech of surprise. She immediately moved to a different position, refusing to stay where they expected her to be. Predictability was death. The creatures went silent after the shot, and Yuna used the pause to check her datapad. The files on Kethvari biology were incomplete, but they contained enough information to be useful. The creatures used thermal vision to hunt, detecting the heat signatures of their prey, even in complete darkness. That was why they had found her so quickly after the crash. The shuttle engines had been burning hot, and her body heat stood out against the cool jungle like a beacon. But thermal vision had weaknesses. Objects that matched the ambient temperature became invisible to it. Yuna crawled to the breach where jungle vegetation had invaded the shuttle and gathered handfuls of cool mud from the soil beneath the plants. She smeared it across her face and neck and arms, covering every exposed piece of skin. The mud was cold and wet and deeply unpleasant, but it would mask her heat signature and buy her precious seconds of invisibility when she needed them most. She thought of her grandmother as she worked, remembering the old woman's hand showing her how to prepare deer hide after a hunt. Almeone had taught her that survival was not about strength or speed. Survival was about patience and observation, and the willingness to do uncomfortable things without complaint. The mountain does not hurry, a grandmother used to say, and yet it wears down everything that opposes it. Yuna had been the only human in her survey corps unit. The other species of the Galactic Council viewed humans as primitive newcomers, barely worth acknowledging, useful only as expendable scouts for missions too dangerous to risk valuable personnel. That was why she had been assigned to this death world. She was supposed to be acceptable losses. The HFY probed the shuttle again before dawn, more aggressively. This time, two of them approached the main breach simultaneously, while a third circled to the rear. Una tracked them with her weapon, but did not fire. Ammunition was too precious to waste on warning shots. She needed to learn more before she committed to violence. She watched their movements and began to understand their pack structure. There were 7 of them, but they were not equals. 6 of them took risks and tested defenses, while one larger creature stayed back and observed. The Alpha, it never approached directly. It sent the others to gather information and then process what they learned. The Alpha was the brain of the pack, and the others were extensions of its will. If she wanted to break them, she had to kill the Alpha first. Dawn came slowly on Veth 4. The amber light creeping across the jungle floor as the gas giant rotated. The HFY retreated to wherever they slept during the day, leaving Una alone for the first time since the crash. She was exhausted and hungry, and her wounds were beginning to ache with the deep throb of infection setting in. She ate half a nutrient pack and drank water she had collected from condensation on the shuttle hull. Then she slept in short bursts, never more than 20 minutes at a time, always with her weapon in her hand. Her dreams were filled with her grandmother's voice, telling stories about the tigers that once roamed the Korean mountains. They were not evil, Hermione had said. They were simply better at being predators than we were at being prey, and so we had to become something else, something that predators learned to fear. Una woke as the light began to fade again. The second night was coming, and she had used 2 of her 10 rounds and learned nothing that would save her life if the HFY decided to attack in force. She needed to change the equation. She needed to stop being prey. Una checked her datapad one more time and found a detail she had missed. The 4 of the HFY had a weakness in their armor. A gap where the plates met at the base of their skulls. A blade inserted there would reach the brain. She looked at her combat knife and then at the jungle beyond the shuttle. The creatures were waking up now. She could feel their presence gathering. In the shadows, they would test her again tonight and tomorrow night, and every night until they were confident enough to end her. But what if she did not wait for them to come to her? What if she went out into their territory and became the hunter instead? The idea was insane. 1 human against 7 apex predators in their home environment with only 8 rounds and a knife. But staying in the shuttle was just a slower form of suicide. She would run out of food and water and energy long before rescue arrived. Her only chance was to do something the HFY had never experienced before. She needed to make them afraid. Una smeared fresh mud across her skin as the last light faded. She checked her weapon and secured her knife and stepped out of the shuttle into the alien jungle. The bioluminescent plants cast their blue glow across her path, and strange sounds echoed through the darkness. Somewhere out there, 7 creatures were preparing to hunt her. They did not know that she was preparing to hunt them back. The night belonged to the predators of Veth 4, but Una Park intended to take it from them.